Well, Peter said that he had a wonky slide, and I don't have any slide. Actually, because the presentation was so short, there really was only going to be maybe one slide, and I just didn't take the time for that. I'm here to compare the state of California's AB 1884 straw legislation with Oakland's, the City of Oakland's ordinance, and basically both of these pieces of legislation only allow straws to be distributed upon request. And initially I was kind of disappointed because it wasn't this big thing, you know, that was going to have a huge impact. And I'll go through some of why I was disappointed, but when I really looked at Oakland's ordinance, I actually became heartened by a couple of things. Because one, it didn't, even though we didn't do a lot, or it doesn't seem like we did a lot, there's room. And there's room for us to come back with hope and reconsider our entire foodware ordinance and what we really want to accomplish. So, first of all, when I looked at the state of California's legislation, I sat down and I said, okay, I'm gonna dig into this legislation. I'm gonna really read it and understand it so I can share with this group what it really says. And there was 3 pages of text, and there was only one sentence in the legislation. It says, a full-service restaurant shall not provide a single-use plastic straw to a consumer unless requested by the consumer. Now, one whole page of the legislation is devoted to definitions, and I was able to whittle that down to 5 bullets. And basically, it defines a full-service restaurant as any place where a consumer is escorted to an assigned table, your order is taken after being seated, the food is delivered directly to the consumer, any additional items that you want are brought directly to the consumer, and the check is brought to the consumer at the assigned seating location. So the state is very narrow and very specific about which restaurants this applies to. And as you can clearly see, there are a lot more restaurants that this legislation will not apply to and it will not capture. And so that was disappointing. But then I looked at Oakland's ordinance, because we passed our ordinance in May of 2018. So ours was in effect prior to the state, but even though the state law doesn't preclude cities and counties from passing additional legislation, ours, because it was a pre-existing foodware ordinance, already applied to all retail food vendors. So it applies to sit-down restaurants, it applies to fast food restaurants, it even defines restaurants that are just a push cart. So if you're selling food out of a push cart on the corner, all this legislation applies to you. And basically that legislation is that on or after July 1st, 2018, no restaurant shall provide a single-use beverage straw to a dine-in customer except on the customer's specific request. And we did hear from the community of the disabled that they didn't want to ask for a straw. They didn't want to have to ask for a straw. That was their objection, because they have to ask for so many things, and they didn't want one more thing to be added. But nevertheless, we went through and we passed it, and as with anything disposable, there's oftentimes a reusable opportunity out there. And so, you know, that's pretty much all there is to these pieces of legislation. There's some enforcement. The state says that it'll be enforced by an enforcement officer without saying who that is. We think it might be Cal Recycle, not sure. The first and second violations, the business will receive a notice of violation. The subsequent violations are $25 per day, and the third and subsequent violation will be, it'll be no more than $300 a day. So that's the maximum. With Oakland, because it was a pre-existing ordinance, the pre-existing fines that were already in the ordinance apply to this issue. So the first violation, they receive a notice of violation, And they could receive up to a $100 fine, and since I'm the one who handles those, I don't ever submit them for a fine on the first notice of violation. Now, on the second notice of violation, they might get up to $200, and I have been successful at getting 200, and it's up to, so the city attorneys can choose a range up to that amount. And then the third or subsequent violation, they get a notice of violation, and the fine can go as high as $500 for Oakland. Our ordinance did require a 6-month follow-up to amend it in order to add additional products to the ordinance that were no longer allowed. But I'm kind of glad we missed that deadline. This ordinance was put out by a city council member. Staff was not given an opportunity to comment on it or add anything to it, and I'm glad we didn't, because we, as those who manage discards and solid waste, we tend to default to the better disposable option. How can we make this a compostable product? How can we make this a better product for disposal or recycling or recovery, instead of stepping back and saying, how do we replace these items with reusable? How do we make reuse the default for our policies and our processes instead of the disposable? So that pretty much concludes what I had to share with you on these two pieces of legislation. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.